Hello everyone, welcome to Studio Fionte. My name is Dan Fionte, and if you're watching this, you probably know that. Today I'm going to be doing a video on how to make an underpainting. I've been asked by some friends and colleagues and students to make a video series on how I go about making a painting, and I'll be doing that. I've never done this before with my own work. I've made videos for other people. So pardon me if I'm a little bit awkward or if there are some glitches or things like that. I'm just going to do the best I can. I figured now's the time, right? We're kind of in quarantine. I'm pretty busy, but just trying to keep my brain working throughout all this. So before we begin, I'd like to say that I probably will be talking a bit about equipment. And if I name a piece of equipment, I will put a link to that equipment in the description. Whether it's the brushes that I use, this nice Nikon, this is a Z7, my other camera's a Z6. There we go, there's two things that I use. And I'll put those down in the description below. I may also talk about an artist who has influenced me in some way throughout this process, I just like talking about art, so I'll probably link them as well. But again, this will be about a 3 or 4 video series. It's got to be fairly in-depth. And as you can see, based on the little scrubber below, it's not necessarily a quick video. So they are for learning. The other thing I wanted to say, given that, is that I currently teach photography, actually. And so I'm not used to teaching painting. I haven't done it in quite some time. So again, pardon me there. And my methods are my methods. I do things maybe differently than some other people. If you've gone to a very traditional school to study art, say an Academy of Realism, I may do some things differently than them, and I may do some things similar to them. It could be that you've gone to a different type of school where you had an individual teacher or instructor who advised you to do a certain thing that I may do differently. You can take everything that I do with a grain of salt and use it if you like it and leave it if you don't. Really, that's kind of the beauty of art. I do think it's important to have methods and, explore and take notes and do things like that. But I'm just here to show you how I go about making a painting, and I hope you like it. Before we get into painting, I want to take a look at our reference image. One question that I get pretty often is, do you work from photos? And the answer to that is yes and no. I typically work from photos in the studio. And, obviously the reason why I'm working from photos in the studio is because I can't bring my studio to a beautiful marsh. But the major reason why I'm working from photographs a lot these days is simply time. I have a full-time job. I'm a father. I've got a lot of other commitments. I'm a pretty busy guy. So it's really hard to find the time to go out, to gather all of my items and go out for a 6 or 8 hour stretch and paint from real life. It's difficult enough to sketch from real life. So I do work from photos pretty often these days, but I'm not copying the photos directly. I'm referencing them. I am using my photography skills to help me compose images, and I'm trying to get the color as close as I can in the reference photo, more for the sake of reminding me of what the scene looked like. So it's important to understand white balance and how to be a good photographer if you're going to use photos in the studio, in my opinion. I am also taking license with these photos, however. I may be changing the color a little bit or changing the saturation. And, the way that paint colors translate when you put them on a canvas is totally different than how they look on a digital screen or in a printout. And there's all sorts of magic that you can do to get all, everything to line up and be as accurate as possible. I'm sure that it's possible to do something that looks just like a photographic print. But that's not my goal. Okay, my goal is to create a painting. And the camera in this instance is simply an aid for me to do that with my crazy life. I do think it's incredibly valuable to go out and paint and draw from real life. And if you've never done it, I think you're missing out. And I think you should try, because it really it puts you in the scene. You really have to think about it. And for that reason, I like to go out and shoot my own images as well. When I'm painting, I'm remembering the scene. I'm remembering the colors that I saw with my eyes, which are probably somewhat different than with the camera, and really the memory of being in the place and existing. I love to work from my own photographs for that reason. People ask me if I've ever worked from someone else's photograph, and the answer there is rarely. I have if it's a commission work where there is a need for me to work from someone else's photographs, but I've always seen the original scene. I've never painted something that I haven't seen in real life, unless I created it entirely from my imagination, of course. But in terms of a thing that exists, I've done commissions where I've used other people's photographs, although I've taken significant license with the composition, the color, and I often will use my own photographs in combination with theirs if there's some reason that I need to use their photograph for whatever, if their photograph was taken on a specific day, or there's some special meaning behind the specific image, I will use it, but I much rather prefer to work from my own photographs. So enough about talking about working from photographs and working in real life. We could do a whole video on that. There's all sorts of things to consider. Let's look at how I'm going to go about making the underpainting for this. One thing we need to do when we're looking at a scene, either a scene in real life or an underpainting, or a photograph, to make an underpainting, is we have to consider what color we're going to make the underpainting. You can use a lot of different colors to make underpaintings. Traditionally, people do a gray underpainting using a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And that's a great combination. Or ultramarine blue and transparent earth red. That's a beautiful combination as well. And sometimes a white. People will throw some white in there too if you want to do a tricolor. Those are kind of classic ones. And I think they work pretty well. But in terms of making an underpainting warmer or cooler, you can do that as well. You could do an underpainting in blue. You could do an underpainting in red. And I think what we're going to do for this underpainting is we're going to do something a little bit more closer to reddish brown than gray. The color that I'm actually going to use as the base for this underpainting is a color by Williamsburg called quinacridone gold brown. And it's not a color that I've seen anyone else make. Maybe they have. I haven't really gone searching for it either, I'll say that. But I came across this color in the store and looked at the sample swatch and thought it looked like a really neat color. It's a transparent magenta brown. It sounds really kind of strange, but that's the best way that I can describe it. When you thin it out, it comes out being kind of a beautiful terracotta color, which kind of reminds me of like the Venetian red a little bit or something like that, but slightly more magenta. And it's just a nice color. And I haven't really done a whole lot of underpainting with it. I've mixed it in with a couple of other paintings, underpainting colors at times, but I've never used it as the major tone. So I'm going to experiment today and do that. And I will, of course, mix in some Ultramarine Deep by Rembrandt and some Burnt Umber by Gamblin, and to get my darks. And the reason I'm going to use that color to do a warm thing is because of these grasses. Okay, so we see these sort of mid-tones. There are these wonderful warm colors. Now obviously we can go in and we can glaze some of that back in after the fact too. But there's a lot of these sort of warmer browns peeking through. And obviously we've got we've got a lot of blue in our sky. We've got some cool shadows. So those will offset nicely against that underpainting color. And I'm also noticing that these areas where the light is touching the grass in the background that maybe have some frost on them, and some of these reeds in the foreground that are kind of a bone white that are reflecting the sky are reflecting some of that yellow, but also reflecting some of the blue from the sky. So I think it would be nice to have the underpainting be warmer, and then we'll be painting cooler paint on top of that, and then maybe going back and glazing with some of the warm stuff to bring some of that warmth back in. So it's kind of a back and forth between the warm and cool for me in this image, the way that I'm seeing it. And that's basically how I've decided to do that. The other way that I decide to do underpainting colors is a little bit simpler. So if it's a night scene, typically I'm going to be doing a cooler underpainting. And depending on the type of light, maybe I'll use ultramarine blue for that. Maybe I'll even do a Prussian blue for that. Prussian blue is a pretty interesting one for cloudy days. It's, with some foliage. It's kind of interesting. It's a little bit greener blue. But, I might do something like that. So again, blues for the cooler scenes, like a night scene or a blue hour scene. And then the warmer underpaintings for daytime scenes, especially the ones that I like to paint, where we have our low angle light, either early in the morning or late in the evening. We've got that magic hour. The underpainting and allowing that to show through in some of the areas where the light is hitting really makes your painting shine literally from within, which is pretty cool. So enough talk about the painting in this photograph. Let's move on to actually doing the painting. So just to show you, I've done a little pencil sketch on the canvas, technically linen, but painting surface, what have you, whatever you're working on. I don't always do this. You can just go right for it and start painting your underpainting. This sketch is going to be obliterated. I mostly did it as a time-lapse test for just to do a time-lapse test for this camera. And also just to set the focus. Again, I'm using a Nikon Z6 camera. And for this portion of the video, at least, I'm using a tilt shift lens so that you've got focus from here all the way back to here. So even though the canvas is at an angle just because of the size of the room that I'm working in, it's really small, I can't have the camera over my shoulder. You can at least get an image that's in focus, which is kind of nice. So where do we begin with this? Well, as I said, we look at our image and we kind of figure out the overall tone. And there is an interplay between warm and cool colors in the image. The grasses and some of that foreground, there's especially interplay between the warm browns and the grays. But I want to kind of have that glow from within. So I'm going to start a warmer underpainting on this painting. A lot of people traditionally do a gray underpainting. My French pronunciation is horrible, so I'm not even going to say what they call it in French. But you do a gray underpainting with a mixture of a blue and a red to get your gray. But really, you can do whatever color works for you. I often work on a stained canvas, not just a white canvas like this. Sometimes I'll pre-stain the canvas and then go in and do the underpainting. But in this case, I want to try to maintain my whites by pulling out, from the underpainting. So I'm going to go over the canvas with a kind of wash. You'll see in a second. I'm going to use this 2-inch large red line brush by Princeton. And it's not, a particularly great brush, but it's very large. So it forces me to paint gesturally and use economy in my stroke. And that's important. So in the foreground here, we're going to have our pond or puddling from the marsh reflecting our sky. I am going to push this a little bit higher. They're not quite as wide in perspective or tall in perspective. And we've got our sky. And so these are pretty bright highlights right here, these two pools. And then we've got some of these highlights in the sky, which I might even add in white for, since those are the sun. And of course, the sky itself is going to be pretty light compared to the foreground. But just to show you which colors I'm using, I've decided to use as my main color this Williamsburg quinacridone gold brown. It's a beautiful color. It's not a color that I've really seen anyone else produce. It's possible that there are facsimiles of it, but it's a neat color, so I thought I'd go with this. If you can see it on the palette, it's this really crazy kind of magenta brown, really beautiful color. And into that, I'm going to mix the more traditional Gamblin burnt umber, and of course one of my favorites, big tube of Rembrandt Ultramarine Deep, to get my darkest shadows when I start getting into that. And then of course I've also got my Williamsburg Titanium White. I also do use Rembrandt Titanium White, and I used to have a tube of Flake White around, but I got rid of that when Max was born, because I didn't want to have a tube of lead paint sitting around my studio. Not that there's a lot of other, there are a lot of other super highly toxic paints in here, but why mess with something when you can avoid something? Though I do like Flake White. Okay, so again, very large gestures. I've also got, oh yes, I thinned the paint with some standard linseed oil and also some Galkid. Okay, which if anyone's never heard of Galkid before, it's a Gamblin product. It's a fast drying oil paint medium, kind of like pale drying oil, but or really it's akin to Liquin, excuse me, Winsor Newton, I believe, or I think that's who makes Liquin. It's a competitor of Liquin, essentially. It's more homogeneous. I like it a lot. But it does dry pretty quickly. And of course, a little bit of white mineral spirits. And I only use Gamsol, okay, because it's what I used in college, and I got used to it. And it has much less odor than some. And turpentine is cool and everything, but I'm trying to keep toxicity down as much as I can. So what I do is I just kind of start in wherever, and just to kind of see where I'm at with value. Again, I can pull this out later. It's dark for the sky, but that's okay. We'll pull it out later. So I'm just thinned my paint down quite a bit there, and I'm just going in and making some large strokes. And yep, that graphite is getting dragged right into the paint. That's okay, because we're going to be going opaque on top of this, and okay, so I'm just kind of, again, I'm going over these details, and I can still see where I've pushed some of the pencil in a bit harder, but I'm just trying to cover at this point. I'm basically doing a stain. where I will end up with some slight detail left over. And this right here, that's a pretty major highlight right up in here with the sun behind the cloud, so I'm going to kind of leave that alone for a sec. And you know, if you happen to go over your highlights, it's not the end of the world. You can pull those back out later with opaque paint. Just trying to get some form down. You know, now that I'm looking at this color reminds me a lot of Conte crayon, like the terracotta color. And I will eventually time-lapse this for you. So you don't have to watch me do every single detail, but I want to get it to a point where I've been pulling some of the highlights out and putting some shadow in before I jump totally into doing that. So, yeah, I'll get there. Don't you worry. Oh, that was fun. I wonder what that was. Yeah. In this foreground, I'm already kind of looking at the textures of the grasses because some of these artifacts, these brush strokes, if you will stay and become a part of the painting. And areas where there are sticks or reeds instead of grasses. So marshes have both salt hay grasses and also this sort of elephant grass. And it's not really razor grass. I mean, I can't really call it elephant grass. I don't know the technical term for it. Sorry, I'm not a biologist, but you know, you've got these beautiful little tufts of orange grass, and then you've got this very tall grass with these large tufts on the top. And here, I think what I might actually do is start switching from this brush and actually go to a paper towel for a second. And you can use a rag if you want instead of a paper towel, but I just happen to have some paper towels right here, and I don't have a rag that is clean enough to do this with. So, again, very gestural at this point, not particularly detailed. Again, I'm just trying to get the major shapes down. I'm getting a little bit of the essence of grass there. So what I might do is go in and just take some of this paint. And I've got this highlight up here. There's a large cloud bank right across the top there. And I've actually, that's probably going to drip still, but if I can maintain that, that would be kind of cool. And then down here I've got open sky. And it's pretty light. So I'm going to go back with that. And there is a cloud here that's hanging. It's right here, but I'm going to go back and put that in. I've got this sort of snowy path here that I like the shape of. So I want to maintain that. I've got this nice hillside, or raised, it's not a hillside, it's a raised field with hay on top. And the front of that comes right along here. So I'm going to go in with some darker value after the fact and fix that up. I'm going to bring my horizon line down a tad. And there's some trees here on the horizon, so I'm just going to leave that for now. Again, you can pretty much change anything. You don't have to keep anything about an underpainting that you don't like, as long as you don't paint it with too much texture. And I know artists who can do some pretty remarkable stuff with covering up a canvas that they did and put a lot of, pardon my head there, just trying to get some of that excess off there. And I tend to, go and I'll actually take this and go down the edges with some of this stain and stain the edge. And this serves two purposes. One, it looks kind of neat. And two, it reminds me of what I used as my underpainting. Now, I don't do painted edges, okay? I do work on thicker canvases, but I don't do painted edges the way some people think of painted edges. So we can come back and fix that later. Not a big deal. All right. Okay. Now, what do I mean by pulling out highlights? Well, we can take a stiffer brush. Let's see. Could grab. I'd taken a filbert out before when I was preparing for the video. See, this shows how amateurish I am. I took this filbert out thinking it would be a good place to start. And then I put it somewhere. I carried it off with me and I put it somewhere. I'm known for doing things like putting my car keys in the freezer. It drives people nuts. So I'm just going to take some spirits, some pure spirits, and clean up some of this area where there's glow on the horizon here. And same in here. And again, this is very quick, but quick isn't bad. And again, we've got lots of mineral spirits just running down the surface here. So what do we do now? Well, I could keep painting with the quinacridone. I mean, I could go in and I could really make some, I could grab some thicker paint and, you know, I could put some value in that way. I could also grab my umber and mix my umber in. And that's going to like dampen down the beautiful tone of that quinacridone quite a bit, but it will get you a value. It will push your values, certainly. But again, I'm still trying to work gesturally here, so I'm just going to take a little bit of that darker value and put it in for my tree line back there at the edge of the marsh. Which actually, this was such a clear day. Not the sky per se, but just the lower atmosphere, that there really isn't a lot of atmospheric perspective going on in terms of fog and things like that. I'm looking at this and I'm realizing my horizon's not straight again. So again, this is where we kind of have to go in and start thinking about what we're doing and really stepping back and looking, and you know, I can lower that down. And there's a big bump right there. I think there's a sort of a hill or a piece of land right there in the background that's just sticking up with a whole slew of trees on it. Marshes are fascinating in their geography. There's also this wonderful sort of grayish silver highlight on the marsh back here. Kind of like reflections on water in the distance, so I'm going to leave that there. Let's see what happens. I'm going to pull a little bit of this blue in. Maybe I messed this up. May have gone a little too hard. No, I think I'm recovering it. Okay. And that blue is really going to set this off and make it super rich. So I've got the stand of trees, and you know, I'm going to go back in. I'm going to have to backfill with some highlights on this just to get in between the branches. Right now, all I really want to do is get a general shape of the major sort of trees. And they're very spindly. I mean, they're this very old cedar type trees. I think they're junipers technically. But these might be cedars actually. These might be different. They're pretty tall. There's a lot of sort of juniper bushes and things out in this marsh. Again, not a botanist or a biologist, but they've got those little berries on them and they smell like juniper, so I'm going to call them juniper. But I'm sure there's plenty of other evergreen trees that have similar things. We've got this sort of valley that comes in here and comes out. And this actually comes a little bit more this way. But as you can see, I'm starting to get a little bit more, and there's our horizon sort of in the way back on that side. And as it gets closer here, I can make it darker. Again, there is atmosphere So there is some atmospheric haze present. This is a much darker shadow than these trees in the background again. And here we've got some sort of skeletal trees and shrubs hanging out on the very edge of the composition, and actually same on this side, but I may leave them off. I may come back to those. That's what license is all about. Okay, and then here we've got this edge of this field. Which actually comes right into the base of these trees, so this goes up a little bit. The angle's a little steeper than what I was painting. And that's the edge of, this is the tops of the grass, and this is the edge of the grass. And this is the edge of the marsh here, where there's been, water coming up and causing a shift in plant growth and kind of dragging down grasses. And, I imagine some animals and people walking along that as well. But a lot of what's going on in this picture is at least somewhat natural. This field up here is mown. For hay, it's harvested every year, as far as I can tell, or it's at least cut. It may not be harvested, it may be left for animals, but it is harvested. But you get the idea. Essentially going and finding my larger, darker shapes, trying to put some value into those. Okay, this is actually, we're seeing light through this tree, and then behind here, there's actually a large, very tall trees on a more not so distant foreground. Again, so there's another kind of hill that's a little bit closer back in here. And then we've got, that's the horizon there. Now, as far as the clouds go, you can go back in, and that's, again, maybe a little bit too dark for that cloud right there, but hey, that's what this is for. You just wipe it out, knock it back. We've got this sort of manatee cloud here. That's what I'm going to call it. I don't know. It looks kind of like a strange manatee thing floating. And it is a little bit bluish, so if I end up with a slightly strange color in my underpainting, well, I guess will just remind me that marsh, that cloud is a kind of a bluish shadow. And here I've got this cloud. It's kind of just going straight across the image. And it's not nearly that dark. But again, we'll just go back and pull it out in a sec. And this one up here is pretty bold because the sun is basically right behind it. So we've got this large, stanky cloud. And some smaller ones going across, and some bands of light and shadow. There's a nice purple cloud band just going straight across here. Looks very much like some sort of Thomas Hart Benton cloud. It's very cartoonish. So yeah, don't mind me. I'm just gonna do my thing. And some of these get thinner as they get closer to the horizon and make little textures as they go. And rinse that, go back to my quinacridone color here. Because the undersides of these clouds, it's they're cooler on top and warmer on the bottom because of the sun being back and behind here. We can't see it. So I'm just doing this to remind myself that there's luminance there. So value doesn't always necessarily determine luminance. I mean, you can still have something that it would be darker in value that is warmer, cooler in color, or is warmer in color and still denotes a light. I mean, I'm kind of rambling, don't mind me. But yeah. And basically this is where I'm at. I'm going to have to stop the video so it can do its thing. I'll do some time lapse and then I'll come back and show some real time of me pulling some of these grasses out, where you just take the back of your brush and you do some texture like that, but we can come back and do some more of that later when we get into more of the foreground. Is over. That was 30 minutes elapsed down to 1 minute, and that was actually some time ago. That's the magic of video for you. It's been actually, I think, maybe a day and a half since I did that. Either way, this is basically dry at this point, so I can't really work back into it. I did do a little bit more detail after the time lapse was over down here in the bottom. And I did a little bit of detail up here in these trees as well. And this underpainting, I mean, you could consider it done at this point, but I want to do a little bit more. There's a few fence posts and some other things that I want to put in. And just to talk a little bit about what I did in terms of which tools I used, again, to remind you. I did most of this with a number 8 Rosemary and Company long-handled filbert, and that's series 278. So this is number 8, so it's fairly large. And I did start this with my 2-inch red line, which you can maybe see in the background down in the bottom right-hand corner there, for the large washes at the beginning of this live speed part of this demonstration. But the time lapse was done mostly with this rosemary filbert. Another rosemary filbert short handle. Number 6 is something else I used here, and I used this with a bit of mineral spirits mixed into the bristles. I kind of went back and forth, and I had a bit of a happy accident, and I realized it was affecting the surface of this very nicely, and I was able to kind of get some grassy textures and things using that brush. And it's a little, so again, it's pretty thick this way, but it does get thinner, and you can get lines with this. And really, again, you can use a corner of a brush to paint detail if you'd like to, a much larger brush, and that's fine. And right now what I'm going to use is kind of a non-traditional brush. Something that people might do in this scenario right now to get more detail is use a round, pointed brush, but I'm going to be using this number 4 rigger. Okay, so a rigging brush, for those of you who don't know what this is to paint long, straight or flowing lines, but where you want long, continuous lines. And it's nice because it's got these very long bristles, okay, and they're quite straight. And when you have paint on them, you kind of just touch the very end and get a very thin line as well. So you can paint detail with it. But the point is that those long bristles hold a lot of paint. So when you make a stroke, okay, you have that nice even thickness or even thickness in terms of the paint going down. So it's kind of like a pinstriping brush. And there are different sizes of these. You can get them thinner, you can get them thicker, you can get some that are very long. Watercolor ones almost kind of look like some sort of like fly tail, like a water fly tail. They're pretty thick, well, thickish at the base, and then they go down into this little fly tail is what I call it. You can get super thin lines with watercolor ones. So I'm going to use this rigger to do some painting. And I will move the camera closer for another shot of some stuff in a second, but I've mixed up some darker paint here, and I'm just going to go in and do some of my tree detail a little bit. And again, you know, underpaintings don't have to be super detailed. You can go back in and do this later, but I wanted to get some of these a little bit more defined. One thing some people ask me is, and this kind of actually has come up ever since college, what do you listen to when you work? I think the first time I was ever asked that question in any serious capacity was in a drawing class with a guy named David Kelly at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And it was an interesting class. It was a lounge, drawing lounge. Basically, it was a bunch of students, usually upper level students, sitting around, mostly talking about art and showing work and doing projects outside of the classroom. And the question that he asked us all on the first day of this class was, what do you listen to when you make art, whether it's drawing or painting or whatever you do? And a lot of people listen to music. And music, man, I love music, but it's hard for me to listen to music when I paint. And I'm not sure why, because the thing that I do listen to when I paint is audiobooks. So I love painting and listening to audiobooks at the same time, and I can do it without really any trouble at all. Very occasionally I will get so engrossed in something that I'm looking at on the painting or in one of the reference images, and I will have to just kind of stop what I'm doing and go back and rewind the book. But it's pretty rare. It's almost as if the two activities of painting and listening are on two separate parts of my brain, going on totally separately, using different parts of my brain. And I know people who cannot listen to audiobooks, and I know people who can't even listen to music when they're painting. I don't like extensive periods of quiet. It's not that it stops me from painting, but it doesn't stop me from thinking. And sometimes I need to stop thinking. So audiobooks are a way to do that. So it provides an input and engages my brain, and I'm thinking and I'm learning and I'm doing things, and my eyes and my hands are kind of doing some of the rest of the work here as I go along and do my thing. Now the funny thing is that that's not the same with photography. Okay, so not the case at all when it comes to my photography. I cannot listen to audiobooks when I do photography. If I listen to anything when I'm doing photography, and not the act of photography, but editing. Okay, so I'm talking about studio stuff, either working in a studio or editing in a studio. It has to be music. and I think this is because I'm not necessarily listening to music lyrics. You can ignore the lyrics of a song and just think of it as sung notes. You can't ignore the words in a book. You could, but there'd be no point in listening to it. It'd just be a person talking in the background. But I do. I cannot do photography and listen to an audiobook. And I think this is because when I do photography, I'm simultaneously reading, even at a subconscious level when I'm making edits. I'm looking for the curves tool or the exposure tool, or various, named tools there in Photoshop or Lightroom. And that really, really throws me off. So I love listening. And what do I listen to for audiobooks? Well, I'm kind of into everything. I do like a lot of different genres out there. But the past 2 years, I have to say, I've been on a big Stephen King kick. And again, those of you who know me will know this already, especially if you know me through school, because we keep our, many teachers keep their sort of recently read book lists up on the classroom wall. And everybody knows that mine is mostly Stephen King these days. So that's kind of interesting. What have I been listening to while painting? Most recently, well, I did take a little bit of a break from Stephen King, and I tried to listen to, or I'm trying to, because I haven't finished it yet, and I will, Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, The Name of the Rose. And it's definitely a heavy one in terms of, I guess the storyline is kind of heavy for some people, I would guess, but really just the writing style, it's a tough one. It's just, there's a lot going on, there's a lot talked about in terms of history. So that one is actually something that I have actually had trouble following painting, but I think I would actually have a little bit of trouble following it regardless. And that's not a knock against him or the book or anything like that. It's an incredible piece of writing, but it's a knock against my capacity. And it's possible that this is just, the pandemic is messing with my head or something like that. It's making me unable to focus. So I don't know what I'm going to read after this. There's this book that was suggested to me about the IRA. And man, that's a rough time in history. The troubles, So it's about that. I will again post the link to that book in the description. I'll also post the link to Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose as well, although many of you have probably heard of it before. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this IRA book. Apparently it is incredible. Lots of critical acclaim garnered there as well. So looking forward to that. And then I'll probably go back to a Stephen King book. Because honestly, I think he's great. I really enjoy his work. So what I'm going to do now is I'll bring the camera a little bit closer. So I'm going to cut here, bring the camera a little closer, and then I'll show you some of the detail working. It'll give you a better idea of what this painting looks like close up as well. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. We are, we've moved the camera. It's now pretty close to the surface of the painting. I wish I had an 85 millimeter tilt shift here, but I don't. So I'm gonna have to do what I can. I'm sort of dovetailed in with the with the legs of the tripod here. My stool that I'm sitting on is sharing space with that tripod, which is a little interesting. But you can get in and if you let this dry for a little bit, you can put your hand right up on the surface. So I'm just using a little bit of thinned paint, again ultramarine blue, mixed with my Williamsburg quinacridone gold brown, and I am painting some of these fence posts, and they no longer have any anything between them. Okay, they're just old cedar fence posts that are sitting out in the marsh. And I'm painting stuff that's, off camera as well. Kind of reaching around the camera here, a little tricky. But I'm going to make a line of these fence posts, kind of going right here. And, again, we'll have to end up painting over some of them and then bring them back later. But it's just showing you the kind of markers that I'm putting in the painting, the underpainting at this point. So then there's this row of them. Let's see. And I realized that during the last little video segment I talked about this rigging brush, or rigger as it's called, and why it's called that. It's because they were made and used extensively for painting the rigging of ships. So again, they're for creating long lines that were very straight and even, as the ship's rigging would be. Now, in terms of the foreground texture, and you'll notice that I just made a little bit of a thing here where I put a little bit too much mineral spirits in that. It started bleeding down, and really, again, that's okay. But now that we're getting a little bit more detailed in our underpainting, I want to preserve some of those nice midtones and not allow so much of that streaking to happen, because we're going to be moving on to our final painting quite soon. As you can see a little bit closer view now, you can see the sort of grass texture that I was talking about. And we can use this rigging brush, and we can go in and just on the side, you can kind of flick it up and create some of these more vertical tufts of grass. Okay, so we've got this little island there, and again, we're going to end up painting over a lot of this, the white there with paint, so we'll have to go back in and do some of these. But again, being kind of expressive and random. I know it seems a little Bob Ross-esque. I can't really knock the guy. Was he the best painter in the universe? Probably going to lose followers by saying no. But, not that I have any followers, it's the first video. But he was onto something. First of all, he had a really soothing voice, and I liked his afro. I mean, I don't have any hair, so I'm a little jealous. But he was onto something in terms of using gestural brushstrokes to create, semi-realistic textures. And we're going to be a little bit more careful in the final painting. Okay, we're not just going to make mountains out of gigantic scrapes of paint from a paint knife, but there is something to be said for letting the brush do what it will, and allowing it to kind of create some of the motion for you, and randomize things a little bit, because real life is random. Okay, nature, sure, there's patterns, I mean, fractals and all that great stuff, which is awesome. But, you know, in terms of exactly how a brush, you know, or exactly how a tuft of grass falls or something like that. And, you know, don't try to repeat the same texture twice. Well, maybe not twice, but too often, because then you end up getting into that territory of sort of gimmicky mark making. And but again, you do you. I mean, if you love Bob Ross and you want to make a Bob Ross painting, I'm not gonna knock you. Okay, that's not what I'm here for. I'm just showing you what I do and giving you some of my thoughts on the matter while I'm here, because why not? So, you know, and again, we're just, you know, at this point, I'm just trying to get some of the shadows under and behind the little hillocks and things like that, and create some depth, because there's a lot going on here in the front. And again, I want to try to get as much of this front in as possible in the underpainting, because it's so dark, and I like having these kind of more expressive foregrounds, I guess, if you will. So I like kind of getting a lot of this brushwork up front, which is easy to see from across the room, and then when you get closer, you know, you see, oh, it's just expressive brush marks, but oh, it looks pretty good. You know, it kind of looks like grass. So that's what I'm going for. And I'm going to redarken some areas too that needed stuff that got hit with some white. I very rarely do I put white in my underpaintings. I did, and unfortunately I wasn't careful with the brush, and I ended up mixing some white in to some of the other darker areas, and that was a mistake, because it really flattened it out, and you lose that glow when you start throwing opacity into the mix. So you really do want to consider which areas of your painting are going to have opaque paint, and come up with a plan for that. You know, I love watercolor. I actually almost treat oil paint similar to watercolor in a way, in terms of just the fact that you kind of do have to think a little bit in advance. The nice thing about oil paint clearly is the fact that we can then go over and you can simply paint over something. But even doing that, enough times you're going to wreck your surface. Okay, so if you're looking to maintain surface integrity, okay, you want to be careful and really try to, again, come at it with a plan. So, you know, honestly, I'm thinking this is already looking pretty good as an underpainting, and for where I want it to be. Something that I had mentioned that I was going to show in the introduction video, I think I did that. I ended up doing some retakes on some of this stuff, so I apologize if there's things that I'm referencing that I said that I referenced before, but I didn't. It's because I probably screwed something up, or my kid walked in and I didn't feel like editing it, I just felt like saying it over again. I'm winging this, I'm not using a script. Again, new mistake there probably, but I don't have time for that. So, ain't nobody got time for that. Well, I guess maybe single people do. Again, these days, you know, I feel actually I'm getting on a tangent here. I feel very fortunate that I have time for this. A lot of people don't. We got to recognize that. So shout out to all of my essential worker family, friends, and people on the front line of fighting this pandemic. And even the people who are working because they have to work to get by. That's not the point of this painting demonstration. I don't want to start soapboxing and scare you guys away, but nobody should have to work through this if they don't want to, or if there's really any way for them to avoid it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are stuck working to make ends meet and putting themselves at risk who really don't need to be. But that's all I'm going to say about that. Anyway, I got sidetracked. What I was going to say was I was going to show you guys how I do some of this texture, okay? But now that it's dry, it's really hard. But what I was explaining just to show you, okay? So one thing you can do, just to illustrate a little closer up, is again, you can take the back of your brush, all right, and use it like a stylus. And you're not seeing anything here because the paint's dry, okay? So there's nothing happening, okay? But you just wipe away the paint like that with a stylus. If you want something that's stiffer than a brush, but that isn't going to be as pointed as this, go ahead and wrap some cloth around the end of your brush and use that. And you'll start to pull out stuff. You do have to be careful not to punch, not a hole through your linen, because I doubt that's going to happen. But not to put a dent or a dimple in the linen. But you can push and pull, and you can kind of wipe away and do things with that. There's a little bit of it. It's basically off camera. It's over here that I did a little bit of that on. And there's a little bit over here as well. Very little. I mean, there's two sections of that sort of back of the brush technique that is just off camera. And again, I'm using a tilt shift lens here, so I can't rotate the camera easily while I'm talking to you about it because it would totally throw the focus off. But that is something that you can do. So at this point, I think I need to stop with this underpainting before I go too far. I think we've got a pretty good lay of the land here, and I think our proportion's pretty solid, and color is pretty good. It is very red, and I know if you look back at that reference image, you're going to go, whoa, it's a lot cooler than that, Mr. Fionte. And it is, okay? But we're going to go over this whole thing, and we're going to glaze it down, and we can make it look much more moody with glazes. Again, glazing is going to be using thinner paint, thinned down with, and made transparent with oil, medium, what have you. You can just use oil, but putting a little medium in there is good too, especially if you've got really thin underpainting like I do here, where we've used some drawing oil. And then those glazes are going to shift the color of this and dampen it down, but you want that texture to show through. I may go through before our next session, not on video, and do a little bit more texture just when the camera's not right in my lap practically. But I'll update you on that on the next video. And so there we have it. That's how I go about making an underpainting. So get your scene, compose it, do a drawing, take a photograph that has accurate color, do what you have to do to get your image, okay? And then do your underpainting. Choose your color, warm, cool, gray. It's up to you. Use whatever colors you want. You can go with the traditional colors. Use whatever brushes you want. Just be confident, be gestural. You're going to end up painting over most of it anyway, so don't be afraid. One thing that people say to me so often is, yeah, but I can't paint, or yeah, but I can't draw. Believe me, I think you can. It's all about confidence. Think that you can? Go ahead. Okay, make some marks. Be confident. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really appreciate it. And my next video will be the color layer. All right, see you then.